G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week, and today is a big day. It marks the end of the wait for the F-16s coming into the skies above Ukraine, and many have been waiting a long time for these jets and waiting day to day, week to week of when we'll finally have confirmation that these are in the air to see what effect it will have. But like it's marked that end, it also marks the start of that stopwatch to see what effect this will have against Russian aerial and ground targets. And I think so much weighs on how these perform for the future of this war, but we'll speak about that at length. We also need to speak about more messaging coming out of Kyiv regarding peace and negotiations and the new peace summit that may be occurring in November, and if Russia and China will be present and what is to come of that. We'll speak at length about this relating to this US and Russian prisoner swap that could potentially be the largest prisoner swap since the Cold War. Again, whenever you see this video, there's probably going to be on those prisoners new information come out, and I'll update you as we go. Of course, we need to look at the maps and see where things are moving, as there is some very interesting movement on the map today. We need to look at the restrictions on Chinese exports of drones and dual-use parts, but how that is affecting Ukraine as well. Legends, I travel a lot and I'm constantly online and I'm connecting to a lot of different networks, and obviously I don't want my network provider or anyone else looking at what I'm looking at or where I am. Well, thankfully today I am covered due to today's video sponsor, Private Internet Access. Now, Private Internet Access is a VPN. Now, you may ask, what is a VPN? A VPN is a virtual private network. This is a tool that makes your internet connection more secure and private. It does this by creating a protected path for your data to travel through, hiding your real location and keeping your online activities how you want them. And that's private. And why use a VPN? Well, for me, you know, I talk to a lot of sensitive contacts, and by using a Private Internet Access VPN, I am assured of my and their protection. Now, what it does is it hides your real IP address, it encrypts your internet traffic, and it makes it very difficult for anyone to track your online activities. And it also then protects your data from hackers, especially if you're using any public Wi-Fi networks. Now, let me give you an example. So here we are on Australian Netflix. Now, Lily and I, we've actually never watched Breaking Bad before, and we really wanted to, but of course it's not on here. So all I have to do is click on then Private Internet Access. This is then to in the US. I turn this on. Let's give it then a refresh. Scroll down and see that we are now halfway through watching Breaking Bad. I use Private Internet Access and I recommend it to all my friends and followers that they do as well and keep themselves protected online. So click my link below, and not only will you get 4 months for free, but you'll be also getting over 80% off. Thank you, Private Internet Access, for sponsoring this video. Now, where we need to start is the main news of the day is the first confirmations and images of the F-16s in the sky over Ukraine. So this was the first photograph claimed here of an F-16, and then this one here of one flying above the western city of Lviv. Now, I'd say that a lot of these planes are doing like demonstration flights over populous areas in Ukraine, in the west, in more safe areas from air defense, and I say west, I mean western Ukraine, for a show of morale, motivation, and solidarity with NATO and the EU standing with Ukraine, as there's been no real good news coming off the front line now for 6 months or more. And these F-16s symbolically have a lot of weight. But what I think that weight is far too much. That if it doesn't have a huge effect like the Charlies, the Abrams, the Leopards, or other systems, the backfire of that could actually be more. And we need to be realistic about what these are versus the change it will have on the front. So let's look over this Bloomberg article. This is the first one I saw about the confirmation of this. The first delivery of F-16 jets from NATO allies has arrived in Ukraine. The number of jets is small. So we are not 100% sure on the numbers. We know the training has been very difficult to get guys through. Recently, we've looked at articles that have said somewhere between 6 and 10 pilots will actually be ready for these aircraft. And by the end of the year, maybe 10 to 20 aircraft, what still isn't that many when we see the overmatch that is still going to exist in the sky, and other messaging saying that Ukraine would need minimum 130, upwards of 200 to really gain air dominance in the skies over Russia. Now, it's unclear whether trained Ukrainian pilots will be able to use combat aircraft immediately or the process will take longer. We've spoken about this as well. These are still very junior pilots on this platform heading into the most difficult contested airspace we have ever seen for fighter aircraft. You've got missiles that'll pull in the tens of Gs after you. So we have believed that these will be used in a lot more safer missions first, and as experience is gained and more pilots or more jets come in and the ability to potentially lose one then could be softened, we may see them doing more dangerous missions. Defense experts, although some, do not expect F-16 to become game changers. I haven't seen any defense expert who says it will be a game changer. The jets may strengthen air defense capabilities and shield the country's population centres from bombardments. So this is one of the big things, and I've said this a lot. These jets can hit whatever cruise missiles they want. But if it can't limit the Su-34, the carrier, the main carrier of the FABs on the front line will continue moving. The systems strapped onto the F-16s are not going to be long range enough to engage the Tu-22, Tu-160, or the Bears well behind the line, dropping the cruise missiles. So they're still going to have to work as like a proxy air defense system in the air, a very expensive air defense system, and some of those missiles use the same ones that are limited in air defense as is. So for the front line movement, that tactical rather maybe than strategical movement, that's still going to move if they can't at least limit the freedom of movements those Su-34s have with the FABs. But it says here, Ukraine will challenge Russia's full dominance of the skies over the Black Sea. And this is something that we've spoken about a lot previously with these F-16s. Where these are most likely going to be most effective is out over the Black Sea, in areas where NATO's assets can supply them information, targeting, everything from things like AWACS flying over Romania and flying over the Black Sea, nor are these heading into the pocket up in here in the east and northeast of Ukraine. Now, typically when we're talking pockets, we're talking 10, 20 kilometre, 5 kilometre pockets, but you've got to remember with something that flies well over 1,000 kilometres an hour, and weapon systems can target tens, if not over 100 kilometres air to air, the pockets become very large with radar systems. It's going to be incredibly dangerous flying anywhere up in here, as a lot of the NATO AWACS are not going to have the range on their radars to supply as much information into here. And this is where Russia will have the most freedom, and maybe down in areas like here's where Russia will have the least freedom of operation, and Ukraine will have the most success with these fighters. Denmark, Netherlands indicated they would allow Ukraine to strike with F-16s inside Russia, although Copenhagen said it would depend on the circumstances. And these circumstances is going to be the same as the restrictions already, that you can hit air defense assets or anything coming into Ukraine. I don't doubt that those are then the restrictions. But like I've spoken about, I believe if these can't stop those FABs and the carriers of those FABs, that front line, as we've seen, will just continue that grind forwards. Now, one thing I'll add on that with these Su-34s is we have seen Russian pages speaking about the tactics change in these carriers of the FABs. So, of course, Su-34 with the FABs doesn't have, unless it's carrying specifically something for air-to-air engagement or air-to-ground engagement, they are now flying in tandem with an air superiority fighter rather than another bomber that does have air-to-air or air-to-ground anti-radiation missiles or anti-aircraft missiles. So if that packet of planes that will make up different types of planes is getting painted by a radar or any targeting, that it can go after either the plane targeting them or the missile targeting them as the Su-34 ditches whatever it has on and gets out of dodge. As well with these, with the glide bombs, with the range, that 30, 40 kilometres, and the ones that have the slight propulsion as well, 50, 60 kilometres, the actual targeting time that they have these to target these is going to be very limited. These are travelling very, very quickly. So by the time it enters your area of which you could target it with a missile, by the time it's dropped those bombs and the time it can turn back from those bombs arriving at the front line is going to be measured in the tens of seconds. So it's going to be a very hard operation to try and limit those bombers dropping the fabs that is having a devastating effect on the front line over the past months. And it's one of the big reasons we have seen that front line start moving. Now, the psychological effect is, of course, huge symbolic reasons of these coming in, but the clock is ticking, like I said in the beginning, to see what effect these will actually have. And I think a lot of others agree with me, that too many people have put too much weight and emphasis on these jets being the future of this war and the future victory. And I believe this is very dangerous, because if this doesn't happen, it has a psychological rebound similar to the Leopards, the Abrams, the Charlies, but these were built up tenfold to any of those systems. And my question is, if these don't end up having the huge effect of what some are expecting, what next is in the pipeline for Ukraine that's not going to take years, that will be the next Wunderwaffen, the next wonder weapon that comes in? And I think too much weight has been put in these jets. Again, the systems being strapped onto these jets, although may work more seamlessly with these rather than the Soviet fighters, it's not going to be 1,000% increase. These jets are still going to be in very limited numbers. Ukraine is not going to want to lose them. Again, there's not going to be some overnight shift of air superiority. I think we need to be realistic about it. And I think people not being realistic about a Generation 4 aircraft in an incredibly complex environment may lead to a backfire of a lot of informational war and propaganda. But again, we will wait and see how these happen. That clock has started ticking. But I believe Russia is already probing to try and find where air defense systems are and maybe where these fighters have been. And we've seen overnight a large-scale drone attack against Ukraine. We haven't seen in a couple of weeks a large-scale missile attack. And a lot of these drones weren't actually with any explosives on them. We'll talk about this. A massive Shahed drone attack. Ukraine is saying in usual fashion that they've taken out all 100%, so 89 drones and one KH-59. Again, any numbers, I don't know how large, but a large grain of salt. But this is where then they were flying. So a little bit of everywhere over Ukraine. And what I think these were doing was probing for air defenses. And then Yusov has come out and said this too: the distracting drones do not have an explosive part. Russia's goal is to exhaust and explore air defense systems. This is not a new tactic either. Ukraine's security and defense forces have been practicing effectively countering such challenges. So flying in these drones, no explosive part, cheaper drone, try and see where the defenses are and then hit them. And we have seen Russia having a lot of missiles attacking airfields out into the west of Ukraine as well in recent months, where we think most likely these jets are going to be. And I think Russia will try and look where that air defense is and try and hit these on the ground. We've seen recently the most success Russia has had against Ukrainian jets has been sitting on the ground. Now, we do have some footage of one of these Shahed drones coming down in a flat spin, your Maverick and Goose style here, coming down. You can see the danger that these still have as they come down with the explosive warhead. We skip to the video and you can still see in the large amount of boom these have. This is still a problem with these being engaged, as well with drones being engaged over Israel coming down too. Don't underestimate, something is not just out of danger when it is intercepted. Once it's intercepted, you have no idea where it is actually going to go from there. So we've spoken over the last couple of weeks, pretty much a month, there's been significantly different messaging coming out of Kyiv about peace negotiations, the willingness to have Russia sit at the table. And in yesterday's video, what we explored was how would maybe a Russian commander or general see this? That if for 2.5 years, Ukraine was vehemently saying there is to be no discussions, we're not willing to talk to Russia, none of this, to now a flick of the switch and we want Russia at the peace conference in November, more messaging coming out like this. How would you interpret that? And I think you could interpret that as, well, that must mean things are more dire than before, because we do know when countries are more willing to come to the table is potentially when things are looking more dire. And we have seen that throughout this war in peaks and troughs of when one side or the other has then had the initiative. And now that Russia has the initiative on the ground and Ukraine now seeking that there may be some peace conference go forward that Russia is invited at, that's new messaging we haven't seen before, how would you interpret that if you were a Russian commander or Putin? So let's look at what Zelensky has said to the French newspaper Le Monde. Now, as you know, I'm all for free media and I can't find this behind a paywall anywhere, so we'll go with what we can find. But giving up Ukrainian territories is a very, very difficult question. The situation on the front line here is described as difficult. So, the entire world, including Ukraine, wants Russia to join global leaders at a planned second peace summit. Now, at the last peace summit in Switzerland, Russia said it was a waste of time, but they also were not invited, but they said it doesn't meet the reality on the ground. And then China also didn't go because they said if Russia's not there, this isn't a serious peace conference or words to that effect. So China and Russia, the main players which need to get on board, didn't arrive, and it failed to pull together the global south for this as well. The majority of the world today says that Russia must be represented at the second summit. Otherwise, we will not achieve meaningful results. But it also needs to be represented, but it also needs to take into then the realities on the ground. Or, as I've said, Russia just will not be interested. They just may not then arrive. Since the whole world wants them to be at the table, we cannot be against it. So what I will say is Russia just may not be interested with this. We don't know exactly how they are assessing the front line at the moment, their manpower strength, their industrial strength to continue the war. And if they are assessing that they can win or gain more land, why would they at this point come to the table? Now, there are reasons they may come. Of course, it ends an unpopular war. It stops the bloodshed. There's all these reasons to also come to the table to end it. But there's also, we need to take into account that if this goes down this year and the guns are to fall silent, it's not going to be Ukraine who hold the initiative at this point on the front line. It's going to be Russia hold the initiative on the front line currently. If it's starting at Zelensky's 10-point peace plan, it's going to be a bit rich of Ukraine to be making these demands while Russia is advancing daily on the front line, while still under mostly domestic industrial capacity. Now, one thing I will say as well, and this is getting a bit more conspiratorial speculation, but I think there's a line here. If Russia assessed that war in the Middle East involving their ally Iran and its proxies, or the H guys around the world, is likely imminent, which it is likely imminent, it may not, but it feels like it, Russia may assess that continuing the missile and drone attacks against air defense systems in Ukraine will limit the Western supplies, which we know can be very limited, of air defense systems in Ukraine and potentially in Israel. Now, what this does is it limits the supplies, but Russia would assess, and I would assess, that Israel will get a supply of these missiles before Ukraine. Not only is there closer friendships between the US and Israel, but US and Israel's economy and trade is interlinked far more. So I think this could be one of the elements that Russia may be assessing as well, is if we can knock out that air defense, if something picks up in the Middle East, it's going to limit the air defense here. We may have more success on the front. And I think that the US may want to bring a close to the war in Ukraine if there's going to be a larger war that seems inevitable in the Middle East. Putin has said here that he's open to negotiations but would only order a ceasefire if Kyiv effectively surrendered territory that Moscow claims as its own. But you need to remember that a lot of these territories, Russia occupy more of it than Ukraine have at the moment. So let's look at the borders aren't really great here. But say Donetsk Oblast, Russia occupy more of that than Ukraine hold currently. So it's going to be difficult for the demands of Ukraine, if they would sit down at the table now, to have Russia feel realistic about this, be going, we're making ground on the front line. Why would we step back from this? And I think the ball is in Russia's court if they were to go to serious negotiations, if they are interested in the first place. Zelensky's push focuses on a sweeping 10-point plan that would restore Ukrainian territorial integrity, return the prisoners of war, and energy systems again. This is not, the 10-point plan spent at this point in time is not realistic without military victories by Ukraine, which is also currently seems a long way, if not years away. Zelensky acknowledged that China is a key player, but he said he did not want mediation from Beijing and instead urged it to pressure the Kremlin to end its invasion. So it doesn't want China to have mediation. As we know, China has its own 6-point plan developed with Brazil, but it wants it to pressure Russia. He said if China wants it, it can force Russia to stop the war. And me and a lot of others, I don't know if China has the complete it can definitely put pressure on Russia, like a lot of countries are putting pressure on Russia, but I don't know if it has enough to completely make Putin end the war and withdraw from Ukraine completely. He said it is a serious challenge that we can't use all the weapons we need to stop the enemy. What would you do if you were us? Of course, if I was Ukraine, I'd want all the weapons to be used as I want as well in the best way to win the war. He says Ukraine's still waiting for weapons from allies to equip recently mobilised troops. And there has been a lot of speculation in circles I speak to, both publicly and privately, about some of these weapons aren't being sent in because they're waiting for Ukraine to actually have a mobilisation for these weapons. It's sort of like it's one and the other. Why are we going to send you all of this if you haven't yet announced the mobilisation of X amount of guys? Apparently there is some friction happening there as well. And if Ukraine breaks the terms of use for the donated weapons, they can say that we won't give you any more help. That's the risk of using the weapons how they're not meant to. But something gift horse's mouth with these weapons. If the weapons are to be used anywhere, it's got to be bought or, I guess, domestically supplied. It's a bit of that. If it's gifted in and it comes with restrictions, they're still, I guess, right to use those restrictions if it could potentially draw them into a conflict or affect that country's trade. I understand that it's bullshit. If I was Zelensky, I'd say it's bullshit as well. But it's just one of those things that a sovereign nation can do if it's gifting you, donating you, then weapons. Now, let's have a look here. With uncertainty for Ukrainian forces looming over the sprawling eastern front line, Zelensky also conceded that a neck-and-neck presidential race in the US, a vital political and military ally, presented further risks. We cannot influence any election, of course. The United States is a challenge today, and there are risks that probably none of us can predict. And it's a fine line to say what is or isn't influence on election. Because, of course, all the Ukrainian media, all the Western mainstream media is going to do their very best to undermine Trump's campaign. So is that a form of influence on election? Of course, with all the bloggers, both Western and Ukrainian or whatever, being undermining Trump's as well. And, of course, you're going to have on the flip side of that, you may have other outside players looking to discredit the other campaign. But I will say again that it is not clear to me, which electoral candidate, whether Trump or Kamala, that if the Kremlin was to influence the election, which one they would actually have. I've said to end the war in Ukraine, you would say whether they want Trump. But it means then the war in Ukraine is done, and Russia then could not continue if they think they can get more land. But I've also said, for my knowledge of the unconventional hybrid warfare campaigns that Russia and China are presenting around the world and succeeding in the global south, I also believe that Kamala would be a far better leader for them to have in the US to push a lot of the information on that rather than Trump. So I'm not convinced if the FSB or SVR or whoever is to influence an election, I'm not convinced which way they would go. I think short term, maybe Ukraine, but long term of those nations is looking to undermine the West through a lot of its own faults to push their own agenda. And I think Kamala would actually be more useful for them in the White House, that represents more of what they're trying to present to the world. The West has lost its traditional values, it's lost its religiosity, it's lost its nuclear family, it's lost this. It's got pride flags at the front of the White House. I think for that campaign, long term, they would actually prefer her to be in power. I'm not sure you could say that I'm trying to influence an election here. Trust me, I'm not a voter. You do you. But we have to have all these contacts and talk what our future might look like if one side or the other wins the election. So it will be interesting to see exactly what happens in that election and how this may change things. So let's have a look at the maps. We'll see where things are looking, but don't forget what we're talking about because other things will line up. So let's look at a claimed Ukrainian advancement here near Ryhodka as well. So we just come up into then the country. Oh, I've missed everything. Wait. Here's Ukraine, the capital of Kyiv in the center. The red area is occupied since 2022. The purple since 2014. The red check ground made over the past 24 hours. Now, no shift shown on this map, but Noel Reports is showing today that there has been a Ukrainian advancement in this area. So to just get an idea, we look at where these two reservoirs are right here. These are the same reservoirs and where this tree line is. So he was showing before this, that red was down along where my cursor is running here, but this map never showed then the Russian advancement to this area. Again, we have shown that if a map isn't right, it can't show gains as well. I believe that's what's happening up in areas like Vovchansk too, but again, wait out because that isn't confirmed. Now, let's come down into Avdiivka and we'll see straight off the bat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 areas on different directions have been made by Russia today, trying to expand and fatten this control, of course, in the direction of Pokrovsk and, of course, in the north as well. Still heading, I believe, for this intersection, at least under fire control, as this has been over the past weeks and months, slowly just building out and stepping forward in here. Very difficult to stop a real grind forward that this war has really become at this point. Now, we see on then the Syriac map, let's just have a look forward. Now, it's showing in the same directions are moving, but it's showing, say, from Vesely, where the grey zone is here, has just been closed up as red. But in the directions of travel, showing the exact same. That's what we like to see because we can confirm then most likely that is what has happened. So let's just move slightly then to the north of here. Of course, another area to keep your eyes on around the New York front. We can see in two directions here that Russia is making ground and that Alexandropol is coming under threat of a level of envelopment here as well as a further push into New York. Now, we'll look on the Donetsk front as well. Now, the NOAA Reports map is showing significantly different from the other maps in here. If we have a look around Pevdeni, but around near Pevnetsy and Druzhba will just sit out from here, that it is showing a different amount of territory to the north of Shumi. So this is showing different in some directions, particularly around here, but he has updated and said there is movement out to the south here, so we can confirm that movement that was shown a few days ago. But let's just move down to New York and we'll see where Syriac is showing. Again, these are both showing, although it may show different, it shows where the Russians have made ground is at least in the same axis. So we will say somewhere between these two maps, Russia has made ground somewhere there. But on the eastern side here, Syriac is showing that Russia have crossed then this main road through Zelezny as well, of course, heading into the center here, which is Toretsk. Again, further putting this envelopment under threat in here as well. And what you need to look at in here is you need to look at where these waterways are. And of course, you're not going to be swimming in a war zone. Now, one thing that is pointed out is let's go grey zone to grey zone of what's contested. People go, there's a 4-kilometer gap through here. Not really. You sort of got two. You've got one of a kilometre here, then you've got then another one of another, say, 500 metres. But then you've got then these waterways, what of course you're not crossing. You've got one here of 400 metres, and then, oh, sorry, I can get rid of this. Oh no. Then you've got one of another kilometre. So that is something to take into account on the ground. It's not just a clear run of flat ground to get out of there either. So we'll just move then a little bit further to the north and come up Bakhmut, Klishkivka area here, where this map is showing different to what the claims are. Other maps will claim that Russia has full control over Klishkivka, but we're not seeing this move. Now, NOAA Reports map today, if we look, this is said water reservoir just here. He is showing that the Russians have made advancement basically from where this map is sitting out to about where my cursor is here. We see where this road comes out to the north. So showing that there has been some advancement in that front as well. Now, that is No, that isn't what we see. We see to the south of Krasnoyarivka that Russia has made an advancement down here as well. Now, what I've said is this has showed on the Surak map to the south of Krasnoyarivka for a few weeks at least that there has been more control here. It's also showed that there has been Ukrainian successful attacks into here, but then Russian successful attacks to then push back out the Ukrainians as well. So I guess we'll wait and see exactly what is actually happening on this map over the coming weeks and days. But this advancement around Avdiivka, it's grinding forward. It's currently not looking like it can be stopped. And what we have spoken about is beyond Pokrovsk, the amount of defensive works are not that great. And between Avdiivka and where the Russians are now, there was a lot as well. There was a lot of defensive lines as well as lines that have held since 2014. Why that is important is now the Russians, if we go front line to centre, are now 25 kilometres from Avdiivka, but now they're actually closer to Pokrovsk by 5 kilometres than they've advanced over this period as well. And this is a threat to the area here as well. So to link this to the F-16s, a lot of this has been made possible by, of course, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of fighting at the front, large losses, but that has also benefited massively from the ability to drop hundreds of FABs on areas and just delete entire zones from 500 to 3-ton bombs. That is what Ukraine need to stop with these F-16s if they're to make a real change on the front, not a strategic change from cruise missiles hitting energy facilities. Of course, both important. I'm not saying they're not important, but the front line could just keep grinding away. Even if those missiles are stopped into centres, yes, Ukraine will have an easier run, but the front line may just continue grinding. Now, we spoke of drones, and I've actually mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again. China on Wednesday expanded export restrictions on a range of drones and drone parts with potential military application, aka dual-use items. Control parts, high-precision inertial measuring units, engines above 16 kilowatts, and wireless comms beyond 50K. So these are pretty serious items. This isn't just your DJI Mavic bloody thing, but we know that the US has been pushing on China, and China is restricting some dual-use items and a lot of trade restrictions going on there. But I have a good friend of mine works in the drone space in private military stuff, not within Russia or Ukraine, within Australia. And he said, well, where do you think that all the Ukrainian parts for these drones come from? To make FPV drones, to DJI, of course, is a Chinese company, the overwhelming majority of these parts, Chinese, that these restrictions we're putting on China, yes, it's limiting Russian soldiers being able to make drones. It's also greatly limiting the Ukrainian guys as well, being able to make drones too. So he said it's a bit of a what is worse, being able to have Russia not make them as easily, or not being able to make them as easily in Ukraine too. He said it's a real problem that we're seeing. And if you watch my interview with the soldier or the New York Times thing, that now Russia have the upper hand in many areas on drones, and the numerical numbers of these FPVs now too. And he said that actually can play into it. Consoles that control more than 10 drones at a time will also be restricted. This is the logical evolution of drones, and I don't like it as much as anyone else, but it will come into swarms of drones, and that will see the limit of infantry's usefulness on the ground. You'll never see infantry not be used, but drone swarms, we don't even have good countermeasures for a single drone in the air currently. And everyone takes the piss out of a shotgun. Well, I'd rather have some bloke with a shotgun than without it if there are drones. And we had, when I was in Afghan as well, which the drone threat was nowhere near, not even a millionth of this, but we had Remington shotguns exactly for that reason. According to official customs data, the top buyers of Chinese drones, this is from Reuters, in 2023 were the Netherlands, the US and Denmark, with Russia ranked lower than 130. Key components, radar, infrared thermal images exported to Russia accounted for a small number of export, according to China's official customs figures. Again, this can be, of course, greatly shifted around of official figures. Of course, China could do that. We might do the same bloody thing, but these countries were in the highest. Now, who, of course, has been sending a lot of money to Ukraine for drones at 54 million euros. Well, Netherlands has been doing that under drone initiatives as well. So what I'm saying is, by sanctioning China on drones and limiting that, also massively affects Ukraine, and Russia and China sharing a border can get around that probably a lot easier than these items being sent into the West, then being sent into Ukraine. Now, we could potentially may be seeing the largest prisoner swap since the Cold War, but there's been very limited on what information has come out, and this may have updated from here. But prisoner swap since the Cold War could be underway, that movements suggest. Peter Whalen, a former US Marine, Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Russian-born British dissident, are both jailed in Russia, disappearing from view on Wednesday. Their lawyers said after at least 7 Russian dissidents were unexpectedly moved from their prisons in recent days. So this means people disappear from view in the West and in Russia, thinking that potentially there may be a swap come underway. If only he played for the WNBA. Reported at least 6 special Russian government planes had flown to and from the regions where the prisons were located. So more saying that potentially this could be happening. A lawyer for Alexander Vanik from the United States declined to confirm the whereabouts of any of this until the exchange takes place, but also that they could be en route. RIA also reported that 4 Russians jailed in the US had disappeared from a database of prisoners operated by the US Federal Bureau of Prisons. So it's looking like definitely something is going down. He said President Vladimir Putin would need to pardon them before the exchange, a necessary formality. So you need to pardon them to then have them go out. The US probably has to do something similar. In December 22, Brittany Griner was sentenced to 9 years for taking a weed cartridge into Russia. The biggest prisoner swap since the Cold War took place in 2010, involving 14 people in total. Now, the exchange is expected to include 2 journalists, the American journal Ivan Kovakovich, which convicted unusually swiftly on espionage charges that he denies. He was handed 16 years in jail in Russia, has already confirmed talks about his possible exchange. So it will be very interesting to see what happens here. People asked me what I actually thought about this. I was trying to get a read on why would this be happening now? And of course we know that the biggest support for Ukraine, from salaries of officials to soldiers to weapon systems to politics around the world, is the US. Regardless of what maybe Ukrainian officials say, the US can have a say overarching all that because of the amount of support that they could limit into Ukraine as well, that would guarantee a Russian victory at that point, or can pump in more that could then influence Ukraine to have more positive outlooks on the front line too. But could these exchanges be for that coming peace negotiations that may take place in November? And I asked then just ChatGPT, why would countries at war who are starting peace negotiations conduct a prisoner swap? And I thought this was interesting because at the end of the day, this is a war between the West and Russia. Just like I will say that the war in Israel, Lebanon, Gaza is a war between the West and then I guess what the Brits will call the acts of upheaval, being Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. If you look beyond where funding goes, yes. But confidence and building measure swapping prisoners can help establish a foundation of trust between conflicting parties. We saw this, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Humanitarian concerns. It is questionable what conditions these people are kept in. Pressure from domestic international actors, not of America. The pressure on America is mostly internal. Reduction of hostilities, reduced tensions and hostility, reciprocal benefits. Each side benefits from getting their soldiers or citizens back. Symbolic acts that help change the narrative from one of conflict to one of reconciliation, and legal or ethical obligations. So take this as you will, but could it have something to do with negotiations down the line? Because regardless of how this war ends, in the coming decades, century, completely cutting off the West's influence into Asia and Eurasia through a cutoff of Russia is not going to be the best way forward in the rise of a multipolar world. But we will see. Anyway, legends, look after yourself. Have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.